Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving right into one of the most astonishing transformations in human history. It's literally the ultimate phoenix arc, the fall, the crucible, and the rebirth of modern China. Over the next few minutes, we're going to chart roughly 170 years of incredibly turbulent history to understand exactly how a collapsing empire evolved into a 21st century global powerhouse.
Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at the century of humiliation, the revolution and civil war, the Mao era, Deng's economic miracle, and finally, China as a modern superpower.
Let's kick things off with part 1, the century of humiliation.
Picture this, by the 19th century, the Qing Dynasty was an absolute behemoth. We're talking about an empire that accounted for an estimated 1/3 of the entire world's wealth. They governed roughly 450 million people, which at the time was literally 1 in every 3 people on Earth. To put that into perspective, they were the undisputed center of the global economy. And honestly, that is exactly why its imminent collapse was so shocking to the world.
Now, this wasn't just some sudden overnight collapse, right? It was a systematic dismantling over decades. It kicked off in 1839 with the Opium Wars, where British forces used their superior naval tech to force China into what became known as unequal treaties. And this external pressure triggered massive internal devastation, like the Taiping Rebellion, which cost an estimated 40 million lives. Following the disastrous Boxer Rebellion in 1899, the pressure just finally broke the empire. By 1912, over 2,000 years of continuous imperial rule ended when the last emperor stepped down.
During this agonizing decline, foreign powers practically sliced up Chinese territory and openly mocked the nation, branding it the sick man of Asia. But here's the thing you need to remember, that humiliation didn't just break the empire, it sparked a fierce, deep-seated nationalism that would entirely fuel the coming revolution.
Which brings us right into part 2, Revolution and Civil War.
So out of the rubble of the empire, you get this massive ideological divide. On one side, you have the urban-focused nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek and heavily backed by Western powers. On the exact opposite side, you have the rural-focused communists, led by Mao Zedong. To survive total extermination, the communists had to rely on guerrilla tactics and endure the grueling Long March. That was a staggering 6,000-mile retreat. Just to visualize that, it's roughly the distance of walking from New York to San Francisco and back again. It was brutal, but it forged this hardcore resilience in the survivors.
But then their bitter civil war is suddenly interrupted. In 1937, Chiang Kai-shek warns his people to basically brace themselves for the absolute limit of endurance. Why? Because they were now facing an existential threat, a devastating, full-scale invasion by Imperial Japan. Many historians actually view this event as the true start of World War II in Asia.
We really need to pause and recognize that the human cost of this era was just staggering. We are talking about 15 to 20 million Chinese lives lost during the Second World War alone. The entire country suffered through widespread famine and horrifying atrocities, like the rape of Nanking, where up to 300,000 civilians were killed by Japanese forces in just a matter of weeks.
But as soon as Japan surrenders in 1945, that fragile truce between the two factions, it evaporates, and the Civil War rapidly resumes. Despite having massive US backing, the nationalists really suffered from crippling hyperinflation and some major strategic failures. So the Communist People's Liberation Army sweeps across the country, eventually driving Chiang Kai-shek and his 2 million remaining troops into exile in Taiwan. And then, in October 1949, Mao Zedong officially proclaims the founding of the People's Republic of China.
Moving into part 3, the Mao era. Okay, so it's 1958, and Mao decides he's going to force rapid modernization by launching what he called the Great Leap Forward. This was a radically ideologically driven policy that just completely upended centuries of rural life at breakneck speed. Peasants were forced into vast state-controlled communes with these wildly unrealistic production targets. I mean, people were literally melting down their own cooking pots and farm tools in backyard furnaces just trying to meet impossible steel quotas. The results were absolutely catastrophic. You had terrified local officials vastly inflating their harvest reports just to look good. The state then took the grain based on those fake numbers, leaving the actual communes with practically nothing to eat. This gross mismanagement triggered a devastating man-made famine that caused an estimated 45 million excess deaths. It remains one of the darkest hours in all of human history. After having to step back a bit due to the fallout of the famine, Mao launches another terrifying campaign in 1966 just to regain his total political grip: the Cultural Revolution. He basically calls on the youth to smash the four olds: old thought, culture, habits, and ideas. Millions of students formed radical units called Red Guards. They plunged all of society into extreme paranoia through brutal struggle sessions, mass purges, and the widespread destruction of invaluable ancient cultural heritage.
This intense era of continuous revolution really only ends in 1976 with the death of Mao Zedong. He leaves behind a very complex legacy. On one hand, a nation finally unified and free of foreign control, but on the other, a society deeply traumatized, highly regimented, and completely economically isolated. His passing immediately left the Communist Party split between strict ideological loyalists and pragmatists who were just desperate to rebuild the country.
That brings us to part 4, Deng's economic miracle. Enter Deng Xiaoping. Now, this is a guy who had actually been purged multiple times under Mao, but he manages to orchestrate a dramatic 180-degree turn. He shifts China away from a rigid command economy and introduces something called socialism with Chinese characteristics. What this meant in practice was decentralizing markets, allowing for private enterprise, and opening special economic zones on the coast to pull in foreign investment. But, and this is crucial, all of this happened while the Communist Party strictly maintained absolute political control.
Of course, the contradictions of this hybrid system became apparent pretty quickly. In 1978, the economic reforms unleash massive growth. By 1980, the strict one-child policy is implemented. But as the economy opened up, public demands for political openness grew too, and those demands collided violently with the state in 1989, when 100,000 students protested in Tiananmen Square. Deng authorized a martial law crackdown, which resulted in a bloody clearing of the square. Yet despite the international isolation that followed the massacre, Deng doubled down on economic development in 1992, sparking an absolutely historic GDP boom.
Look at these numbers, though. The economic miracle Deng's policies unleashed was truly unprecedented. Back in 1990, over 80% of the Chinese population lived in extreme poverty. Fast forward to 2020, and that number had plummeted to effectively zero. It was the fastest sustained economic expansion by a major economy in history, literally lifting hundreds of millions of people into the middle class in record time.
And finally, we arrive at part 5, a modern superpower.
The hallmarks of this new era are really distinct. China joins the World Trade Organization in 2001, effectively becoming the factory of the world overnight. They host the spectacular Beijing Olympics in 2008, and by 2009 they overtake Japan to become the world's second-largest economy. However, it's important to note that this immense prosperity and stability is maintained alongside strict internet censorship, the famous Great Firewall, and an incredibly sophisticated network of domestic mass surveillance.
The political framework has been evolving right alongside the money. Initially, economic integration was guided by cautious, technocratic leaders like Hu Jintao. But a major shift happens in 2012 when leadership passes to Xi Jinping. He drives a rapid consolidation, creating a highly centralized, assertive, modern superpower. It's fascinating. A full century after the very last emperor stepped down, a powerful new framework of central control was firmly finalized.
So, considering this incredible phoenix arc of fall, crucible, and rebirth we've explored today, from the absolute depths of the century of humiliation to the soaring heights of modern superpower status, we have to ask, what is the ultimate price of this stability? And more importantly, how will China's continuing evolution shape our entire world tomorrow? Thank you so much for exploring with us on The Explainer today. Keep learning, and I'll see you on the next one.